In this video, we'll be creating a mandala using the Jeweled Leaves collection. In addition to this mandala, we'll also be creating a Fodder sheet using all the scraps from the cutout shapes. So what I have here is the quarter sheet with the shapes, and then I also have printed the mandalas on 4 different collage paper backgrounds. You can print all 4, or if you'd like, you can just start with 1. And I'm going to go ahead and choose this one for the mandala today. You'll also need a small brush and a large brush, some Mod Podge, and here I have some in a deli container, a large pair of scissors, or you can use a paper trimmer. I have a small pair of scissors and then a wet and dry cloth. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And the first step is to cut out the shapes from the sheet here. And what I like to do is take my paper trimmer and simply cut this into 4 sections. You can do this with a large pair of scissors as well. And then what we want to do is to cut out each of these shapes on the outside of the black line. That's so that it will fit the mandala template that we have here. What I like to do is to try as much as possible to keep that background intact. And that's so that I can glue it onto another sheet of paper and then decorate that paper for collage fodder. So what I find the easiest to do is to cut these into sections. And you can do this any way you'd like. But I cut out each of these little clusters of shapes just like this. What we'll end up doing is putting these shapes back together on a sheet of, you can use white paper, or here I used a journaled page, but we'll be gluing these back together like this. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for the rest of these 3. Okay, now that I have all of my shapes separated into clusters, I'm going to go ahead and start cutting them. Again, we're cutting on the outside of the black line. And you can do this however you'd like, but I like to try to keep this background intact. So I'm going to carefully cut on the outside of the black line and just maneuver around each of these shapes. If you end up not being able to cut this and keeping the background in place, that's fine. You can still put the pieces together on a sheet of paper, or you can use the little bits for some fodder on their own. So just cutting each of these shapes out. And rather than doing all of this on video, I'll do it in the background and come back, but I'm going to just show you for some of the small pieces here. I try to do the same. This is a little bit trickier to keep this piece intact, but with practice, I've been able to just carefully maneuver. Again, if it comes out in pieces, that's fine. but it's kind of a fun practice to see if I can carefully cut and keep the background in place. And so this is what I mean. I've been able to successfully cut out the shapes and then keep the background intact. And then I'll be able to add it back onto a piece of white paper or a decorative piece of paper and then add some doodles. And this will be a really nice piece to add to some collages in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out the rest of the shapes off camera, and then I'll return back here with all the shapes cut out. All right, now I'm back with all of the mandala shapes cut out here. And then I also organized the scraps onto this sheet here. So we're going to go ahead and collage the mandala. This is one of my favorite parts. It's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, but you get to choose your color palette. So what I want to do is just choose the shapes for each of these over here. And I can just start laying them down. So maybe doing this yellow. And for these mandalas that are even number, I could do every other in a spot. So something like that. Now I'm not going to use these because this is the same color. So I'm going to put those aside. And this part is just about playing. So just testing out what you like. And I'm going to go ahead and play here for a bit. All right, I'm finished here. So I organized these how I wanted them, and I have a lot of shapes left over here, so I can either do more mandalas with the other backgrounds that I showed you earlier, or I can use these for collage fodder. And what I mean with collage fodder, that's just pieces that you can use for other collages. So for example, these little shapes I could add to the borders of this mandala. These may be a little large, but maybe I could put them in the corner and do something decorative like that. So many, many possibilities with the excess pieces that we have there. So let's move on to gluing the shapes onto this mandala. So what I'm going to do is get my workstation ready, and then I'll be right back. All right, so I have my workspace all set up to do the collaging. I have the mandala and the shapes. I have a small and large brush, my Mod Podge, and a wet and dry cloth. And the way I like to do this is to move all of my shapes out of the way. So I just move them off to the side, and then I will start from the center. You can start wherever you want. I'm going to start at the center and put a layer of Mod Podge. And what I want to do is put enough down there so that when I put my shape there, I can slide it around a little bit. If I don't put enough Mod Podge down, it's just going to stay where it lands. And if I don't line it up correctly, it'll be a little off, which is fine. But I like to try to get it as close as I can. Here I like to do the brush strokes in one direction if I can remember to do that. Sometimes when the Mod Podge dries, you can see the brush strokes. So if they're all in one direction, I find that better. And I think that one's just a little bit off, but that's okay. And then just moving along the mandala. So brushing on some Mod Podge, laying down the shape. If I put too much Mod Podge on, I find that I can't actually see the black lines on the mandala. So it's a balance between enough So it slides, but not too much so that I can't see the lines. And we're going to end up adding some acrylic markers to the mandala, so any mistakes, they're not going to be seen down the line. And if they are, that's fine. This is a nice handmade creation. And I'm going to go ahead and Mod Podge all of the shapes on there now. Now I have all of the shapes glued down, and I'm going to move on to my large brush. What I want to do here is coat the entire surface with Mod Podge. This way it's going to add a protective layer to the paper, and then when we end up adding the acrylic markers, it's going to give a nice smooth surface. And also the acrylic markers, as long as they're wet, I'll be able to wash them off if I make a mistake, if there's a layer of Mod Podge on there. So just dipping my brush, and the same thing, just going in the same direction. I'm giving a coat on top of the entire surface. And I was just using my fingernail to hold it so the paper doesn't slip, and everything has a nice coat. I'm going to go ahead and move this off to the side and allow that to dry. And then I have my wet and dry cloth, so I'm going to go ahead and clean my surface. I'm working on a silicone mat here. And then make sure the surface is dry. Now I'm going to move on to the background scraps. Let's see, I'm going to put them right there. I'll move this stuff to the side, and what I like to do is glue these onto another piece of paper. So I could do them on a white piece of paper, or sometimes I like to do this on my journal page. This is from the monthly journaling session. And then you can either glue all the scraps onto a separate page, and you could even print out another piece of collage paper. So say you have this collage paper without the mandala on it, you could even glue down the shapes onto that. So just have the collage paper as a background. So all sorts of things that you can do, but what I'm going to do is glue them down onto this sheet. I am going to show you one more thing. Sometimes I like to leave some of them just as loose scraps, because then I can glue them directly onto collage. So this, for example, is from another kit. This is from the Frog collection, but let's see if I wanted to add this into this collage. So you can see how these little scraps can be used to add interest to any other collage that you're doing. So here, just making a decision what you want to do with them. So you can do a whole combo, glue some down, save some for later. And I'm going to go ahead and glue them down. And I'm going to use my large brush for this. So coating the paper, and it's the same thing. You want to put enough Mod Podge on there so that you can slide the pieces around. I'm actually going to do a little bit more. I want to make sure I went across far enough. And then I'm going to just line this up in the corner and just kind of slide around till I get it just so. And then moving on. So just putting the pieces back together. And of course, it doesn't have to be exact. And going here. Just lining it up as best I can. And then as my hands are getting sticky, I like to just wash it off so I'm not ruining the collage paper. So that's why I always like to have a wet cloth with me and a dry one. I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of this. So getting enough Mod Podge on there and then laying down the scraps on this piece of paper. All right, so all set here. I'm going to just lift it so it doesn't stick down to the surface. And I did struggle a little bit with some of it, but this is just pieces that we'll be able to use in other collages. So the next step for this is going to be adding some doodles with the acrylic markers. And then these pieces can be cut up anyway. And actually, the last step I forgot was to coat the whole thing. So before I clean up my station, I want to make sure that I've coated the entire surface with Mod Podge so that it will add a protective layer to the paper. And it'll be a lot more enjoyable when I'm adding the acrylic marker to a coated surface. Now, typically when I'm done with this, I'm typically done with the large brush at this point, but I'm not sure. So I'll probably wrap this in some plastic wrap. I don't have that in front of me. So I'm going to set this aside. And then to make sure that this brush doesn't dry out, I'm going to set it inside of here. And then this cover that I've cut an X in, I'm going to just slide that brush in there so it doesn't dry out. So I'm going to move that aside. I'm going to cover this. I'm going to lift this, let this dry. So I'll move that to the side and then I'll clean up my work space. So just making sure that I have it all nice and clean for then when I come back with the acrylic markers. I have my plastic wrap here, so I like to take a piece of this and wrap my large brush in this. This will keep it nice so that it's not drying out if I'm using it later in the session. So I don't like to keep it in too long, like maybe a couple hours, but I try not to leave this overnight because then the brush could start to dry out and the glue can get stuck in there. So for a couple hours, that's fine. The other thing I want to show you is I either use a plastic container like this or maybe a small bag for all of my scraps. So everything that's left over from this part of the collaging session, I mean, these aren't going to just, they'll get moved around, so that's fine. So I'm going to just throw those in there. And then I will probably have to reorganize them before I start using them again. And then I'll just show you another option would just be to keep them in a bag like this. This is a handy way to store them too, because you can see what's in there. So either way, I like to use either a plastic container or a plastic bag for scraps for future collage projects. Now we're moving on to doodling the mandala. So I have my setup here. The first thing I want to show you again is the color wheel. We have the yellows all the way to the blues. Again, these are analogous colors. And what I've done is I've picked out my acrylic markers to match the palette. So I have my yellows, greens, the teals, and the blues. And then I also picked out a white and a black. What I also like to have when I'm adding acrylic markers is a jar with some water in it, some cotton swabs. This will be used if I make any mistakes and I want to wash it off. And then I have some baby wipes, and these are helpful for cleaning up the acrylic markers at the end. The other thing I have is a scrap piece of paper. So this is from the sampler page, and this is to test out my acrylic markers before I start. And before we begin, I want to show you that I went ahead and made a copy on my printer. We've already done quite a bit of work here, cutting out all the shapes and collaging the mandala. And if you want, you could save the original and then make copies to doodle on that. This is a nice thing to do if you want to just try out a bunch of different doodling ideas. I am going to keep my original, so I will work on the copy here. The other thing that I like to have with me is my guided doodling sheet, and I've actually gone ahead and done 3 different ones, and this is going to give me ideas as I add the doodles to the mandala. This was done in the guided doodling session, and you can check that out on the YouTube video. Okay, so let's get started. What I typically like to do is start with the black. I'm going to give myself some space here, so I will move this off to the side because I like to have plenty of room to move the mandala. So typically I like to start with black. I'm going to go ahead and test that. Just want to make sure that it's running smooth, and it's actually not. Typically I test these all out before I begin, and I didn't, so you can see what happens here. That one's not working great. So I'm going to take one of my baby wipes, wash off the tip, and then I'll test it out again. So sometimes it just takes pushing it up and down. And see, now that's flowing nice. Okay, I can set that aside. So what I typically like to do is I like to start in the center and work out. And I like to start with the black marker, as I said. And I have, again, my guided doodling sheets to grab ideas if I want them. So I'm going to go ahead and just think of ideas. In the last guided doodling session, we worked on circles and lines, and I could stick with just doing circles and lines here, or I can add any other shapes that come to mind as I move along. Just starting in the center and then moving out. So adding lines. And I like to keep my drawing hand in the same place and turn the paper as I go. And the reason I like to do that is so I'm not reaching across and smudging it. So keeping this hand steady, sometimes shaking the marker to get it going or pushing it up and down. And just seeing where my hands lead me. Adding circles to the shape here. Then moving on. Four lines. not worrying about if it's exact. Just moving along. And I'm going to go ahead and complete this with the black markers, just relaxing into it. I've gone ahead and completed all the black lines and shapes that I want to do inside of the shapes here. And then the next step I like to do is to find the connections between the shapes. So we did that again, we did that on the guided doodling sheet. So just taking a look at different ways that we can connect the shapes. And I can use this as reference. I can start trying to replicate this exactly or just go with the flow using this as an idea. So just looking for connections. That came out really thick, so I'm going to try to replicate that. That was a mistake, but that looks actually pretty cool. Getting all of these thick. And continuing to look for connections between the shapes. Again, keeping my drawing hand in the same place and then moving the mandala as I circle around. And just seeing where my hands lead me. I'm trying to decide if I want to do anything else inside of there. But I'm going to move along. Just finding connections. So I'll continue looking for these connections as we move forward. Okay, all set there. So we did inside the shapes, between the shapes, and then the last thing I like to do is decide if I want to create any patterns or shapes outside of the shapes. So we practice that again on the doodling sheet here, just looking for different ideas of outside of the shape. So just seeing where your hands are guiding you. Okay, so I've completed everything that I want to do with the black marker. So at this point, what I like to do is wash off the tip with the baby wipe. Make sure I wipe off any paint that's along the top here, and then I'm going to cap it. And then I like to typically move on to the white. And I'm going to start filling in some of the shapes that I made with the black marker. I want to test this out before I go. So just pushing it up and down, and that's flowing nice. And starting at the center, just thinking about where I want to add white. I'll be adding some of the other acrylic markers as well, so I want to leave some spaces for those. The white just adds so much nice contrast here. I love starting with this so I can just really see the design starting to take shape here. At this point, I feel like I'm done with the white marker, and I'm going to go ahead and move on to another color. I'm going to choose a yellow. So shaking it and testing it before I start. And just looking for spots that I might want to add the yellow. So adding it to this blue in the center. Within this palette, the yellow and blue are the furthest from each other on the color wheel, so that's what's going to add the most contrast. So maybe I'll go ahead and put some yellow up in this blue here too. And I'm going to move on to a green. And the green is between the yellow and blue on the color wheel. So yellow and blue makes green. So adding green to any of these areas. See here on this yellow. I'll just go ahead and look for areas that I want to add the green. And I'm finished with the green, and I'm going to move on to a teal color. Going ahead and testing. And just looking for areas that I want to add the green blue. And moving on to a light blue. And now I'm picking another shade of blue. This is a darker blue. I'm going to test it. And looking for areas that I want to add the dark blue. And I'm done with that, and I'm scanning the mandala, just looking for other areas that I might want to add some marks, some colors. And I'm pulling out my white again, because I think I want to add some more of that. And I'm scanning it again, seeing if I want to add anything else. I'm looking at the center and thinking I want to add some more patterns and shapes. And you can add as much or as little detail as you'd like. Sometimes I let them sit for a little bit and go back. And I'm just continuing on here. And at this point, I feel like I'm done. I'm really loving how this looks. So just scanning it, and I am going to let all of the acrylic paints dry at this point. The mandala is completely dry, and I just like to scan it and see if I want to add any other details. And I'm really enjoying it the way it is, so I'm going to keep it. And I do want to give you one more tip. You may or may not want to do this. You can see that the black lines with the acrylic marker are a little bit darker than the black lines that came out of the printer. In order to add just more contrast and detail, I like to go over the edges of the shape with the black marker. So this will just make the mandala look a little bit more cohesive because all the blacks will be the same color. So going shape by shape, I fill in all of the black lines. And here we have our first jeweled leaves mandala. So at this point, you can continue to explore this collection. You should have plenty of shapes left over that you cut out. And then there's still 3 more backgrounds to choose from in this collection. And to show you what I did on the side, I've already created some collages with the additional shapes and backgrounds. So that's something fun for you to explore. And then next week in our Mandala Monday, we'll be using the same shapes and mandalas, but we'll be mixing and matching them with our Teal Tango collection. So that's going to be an exciting project because you'll be able to see how all of our templates can be mixed and matched with other collage papers. So let's continue on. You could actually stop here if you'd like, but if you want to continue on and learn how to put this on a canvas, a stretch canvas, I'm going to go ahead and show you that now. So what I like to do first is cut this down to size, and I'm going to grab my paper trimmer. What we want is an 8 by 8 inch square. So in order to do that, this is 8.5 wide. So in order to make this 8, I want to cut 1/4 of an inch off of one edge. So I'm going to line this up. If you don't have a paper trimmer, you can measure that out with a ruler. Okay, so I'm going to just line that up. Cut 1/4 of an inch from this side. Hopefully I did my math right. I didn't write this down. And then 1/4 of an inch from this side. It's a little bit tricky. You could, if you're having trouble getting it to stay where you want it, you could take a piece of tape, which I think I'm going to do here. So I want to line it up to this 1/4 inch. Right like that. So that'll make sure it's not moving. And then I can just lift that up. So the other dimension is different. So this is 11 inches this way. So we want to do 11 minus 8, which is 3. But we want to split that in half. So we want to do 1.5 inches. So 1.5 plus 1.5 is 3. So we want a total of 3 inches cut off to make it an 8 inch square. So 1.5. And 1.5. Okay. So let's move everything aside here and grab the canvas. Just get this out of the way. Okay. So the canvases are 8.5 or 8 by 8, but they're not perfectly exact, which is okay. This is gonna fit well. So what I want to do now is flip this over, and I'm gonna coat the back of this with the Mod Podge. I prefer to coat this, let it soak into the paper till the paper's curled, and then place it on the canvas. I have not coated my canvas with anything. Some people will use a gesso, but I'm going to just get this Mod Podge in there, brush it back and forth so it really soaks into the paper, into the fibers. This coat, you want to really do really nice coat. What we're trying to do is prevent wrinkling and bubbles from appearing when we place it, and I find that the best way to prevent that is to really make sure that there's enough so that it's soaking up into the paper. So let's lift this up, and you can see the paper's really curling. I hope you can see that. Okay. So now what I want to do is line this up. And my cuts are a little bit larger, but we'll be able to trim that. So now what I want to do is really make sure that this is pressed in to the canvas. You can take a credit card or another type of card, kind of from the center, pull it out. Sometimes turning it over. Okay. So at this point, you really want to let this sit and dry. You might, sometimes I see bubbles and wrinkles appear, and then as it sits longer, those go away. So I let this set for a bit, and then I'll come back. This is still drying at this point, and I'm just taking a look to see if there's any bubbles forming by turning it. And I'm not seeing any. There are times that I do, and it's hard to know when you're supposed to push them down when it's still a little bit wet, because I have found that sometimes they tighten up and disappear. Other times I can't help myself but to try to push away some bubbles. But this is actually looking really good right now. So I'm going to leave that there, and at this point I want to decide on what borders I want to do for the finished piece. So here I use this pattern paper, and I think the best thing to do, I've already cut out. I like to have some of my samplers just cut out and ready for just testing palettes and combinations. So I keep these in a plastic bag, and when I'm doing something like this, I use these as my little sampler to see what I want to do. So just looking at different options. So these are a little bit dark. I'm thinking about a little bit lighter. Even this. So just going one by one, and I'm going to flip through these and make a decision on what I want for a border. I could also double up on something, so I could do something like this and then another one. So I'm going to play around, and then I'll come back with a decision. And at this point, I think I've made a decision to use this as my border. And I'm just not going to know until I try it. So I'm going to go ahead and make that decision. I'm going to move this one over. And then what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and print a full sheet of this pattern. And here I have it. So this is a really beautiful pattern, and we're going to end up doing this along the borders. So I want my handy paper trimmer again, and I'm going to, I've decided on what measurement typically works, and it's 1 3/4. But I'm thinking maybe I want to do it a little bit bigger. So I'm gonna do 2 inches just to make it an even number. So I'm gonna go 2 inches, and I need 4 of these. Now, part of the reason that I chose this is that it's a nice contrast between the darker of the background here, so it's the border is going to stand out better than if I use something like this on this background. So that's kind of how I was going about making my decision. As I flipped through, I think the ones with the more contrast were just popping out a little bit more, or they definitely were. So they were more appealing. So at this point, what I want to do is trim the edges, I think. I'm going to go ahead and do that. You can try it with a pair of scissors, which I'm going to do. Sometimes an X-Acto knife might work better, but I'm able to get it with scissors. And it doesn't have to be completely exact. It's a little bit tricky to do, so maybe I'll show you with the scissors and with the X-Acto. If the edges are a little bit ratty, that's okay, because we're going to end up covering them up with this collage paper here. So this is pretty good. This side I'm going to try to trim a little bit too. Okay, so at this point I want to decide on how far in I want the borders to go. And what I found for this design, and it does depend on how far you made the doodles come out, but about 3/4 inch is what I'm going for. And what I've done here is simply cut out a strip of cardstock using my paper trimmer. So I'm using this as a template. And what I want to do is hold this there. It's a little tricky, but I'm just going to get it as close as possible. I could actually tape it down. That's probably the best way to do it. And then I'm going to use a fine tip Sharpie. A pencil may work, but we'll be covering this line. We're going to be gluing it down just above this line. So I'm going to go side by side, line it up. I'm kind of using my thumb to guide where I want it to go, push the tape down, and then draw the line. So we're going to go ahead and glue these down one by one. And I'm going to move this to the side. This is just a scrap piece of chipboard. I'm going to use this. This keeps my surface here clean by doing this, using this chipboard. So you can see the paper's already curling. When I lifted it up, it curled right up. So that's how I want it. And then what I'm going to do is line it up to that line and then just above it. And it's centered. I'm going to push this down. Then I want to push it along the side. You see that? So here, along the side, and then down the bottom. Okay. Now we're going to the edge, and we're going to add some Mod Podge here to the paper and to that corner there. I'm going to push this down and pinch it and pinch that. So I push this down here, and then what I want to do is make sure there's a little bit of glue on that little triangle that I just created. So that's down, and then I'm going to push these over. Okay, so I'll do it on the other side as well. Make sure that you can see it here. So glue it. Push the middle down and pinch. Make sure there's glue here and there. Make sure this is pushed down and then pinch and pinch. So we have a nice tight corner there and there. And then the front side. Now my hands got pretty messy there, and if I have Mod Podge on there, it's going to stick to the paper and start pulling it off. So I do want to make sure my hands are clean and dry as I move along. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the next one. This is a little bit, just a tiny bit different. I'm going to do this side. I'm going to go for this side now. So same thing with adding the Mod Podge to the back. This one we're going to line up a little bit differently. We centered the first one. For the next one, we want the edge that's on the piece that was already laid down to be flush. So flush with the side here. Okay, no overlap on this side. And then we're going to just go just above the black line to cover it. And then for this part, we're doing the same thing. We're rolling it along the side. And flip it and push it down. Okay, so one side is flush already, and now the other side has the overhang. So here we want to make sure there's enough Mod Podge there and on the canvas. I could be using a small brush, but I have the large one out already. So we're going to push this down and then pinch the sides. I'm going to just wash my hand on the side because it's getting very coated with glue. So those are pinched. And then I'm going to add the Mod Podge here and here. We're going to fold that down. So nice tight corner. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next side. And this is exactly like we did for the last one there. So add the Mod Podge, making sure it's coated. See, it's curling up already. So I'm laying this down. I want this side flush to the edge, so lined right up to the edge. And then this side is the overhang. So push that down. And we want to roll it along the side. Flip it and push it down. Now coming to this corner here, just changing the angle a little bit so you can see it in a different way. We're going to make sure there's enough Mod Podge. Pushing this down and pinching these sides. Mod Podge. And then fold. Okay, so we have 3 sides done now. The last side's a little bit different than the other 3. I'm cleaning my hands, cleaning my workspace before I start there. Okay, for this one, we're going to coat the paper as we have done previously. And here we're going to lay it down like we did the last 2, where we're going to have it flush on this side. Cover the line. Now what we're going to do is a little different. We're going to take our scissors, and I want my large scissors for this. I could wait. Actually, I'm going to wait. I'm going to start wrapping it, and then I'm going to cut it. Sometimes I cut it first. Let me at least wrap it down this way, because I don't want to cut it too short. Just like that. And here, I'm going to cut it. So I'm going to cut it right there. See, just like that. And like that. So this one, we're not doing any folding. We're just cutting it so that it's exact. And then we're pushing that down. So this is how to get great collaged borders and edges on a canvas. So look at that. Look at how nice and tight all of those corners are. The last step that I like to do when I use a collaged border is to coat the entire thing with Mod Podge. So I'm going to go side by side and add a layer of Mod Podge. And then I like to set it down on something to dry. So here I have it just on an empty deli container. So this is completely dry now, and at this point your mandala can be complete just as it is, or you can add some more doodles along the edges. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we can use some of the shapes that we have left over to add to the borders or any other parts of the mandala. I'm going to go ahead and lay down some shapes along the edges and just see what I come up with. So maybe these blues on the corners there. I'm thinking maybe putting these, and I'm lining them up with this shape there. So that's kind of nice because it goes over the border and brings it into the mandala. And then I'm thinking, so this background, we have these little shapes with the same pattern. So maybe putting those inside of these. So for each of these. And I'm really liking this just like it is. So I'm going to move them aside and then glue them down. So I have my Mod Podge. I have a small brush here. And I'm going to add the Mod Podge just directly on the collage and then put these pieces down. And then I want to add a coat of Mod Podge on top of the shapes there. So I'm going to go along the entire side and glue these down. Okay, so this mandala is complete. I'm going to let it dry and then we'll take a look at it in a moment. All right, here we have it. The first jeweled leaves mandala complete and on a stretch canvas board. So what I think I'm probably going to do is come back and add some doodles. I do want to have this sit for a little bit just so I can reflect on it and then come back with some ideas, maybe inside the shape, maybe along the edges here. I'll pull this one out. So I just added some doodles along the edges, but I'm gonna come back. But as you can see, you'll be able to, with the rest of the shapes, and again, you can print as many of these as you want, but you can come up with a whole series of mandalas with the Jeweled Leaves collection. So I hope you have fun with this. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll be continuing on with the Jeweled Leaves collection, but we'll be creating florals in the next session on Floral Wednesday. So I hope you'll join me there because we'll be able to just explore using this palette in a whole new way. All right, enjoy. Thank you for joining me.